So Takao Ozawa was born in Japan in the late 1880s and came to the United States and actually resided in Berkeley, California, went to Berkeley High School, went to UC Berkeley, and eventually moved to Hawaii and became a very successful businessman. And he wanted to, and he was successful, and he was really invested in becoming an American. It was really important for him to gain that recognition that he was contributing to American society in the same way that everyone around him was doing, all his business friends. And so he sort of made a case that, because of all of his virtues and all of his hard work and all of his accomplishments, that the court should recognize that, and that should be considered as a merit for American citizenship. Well, this sort of went through the courts. He wrote his own brief. I mean, he's very articulate about sort of his position. And finally, in the early 19th century, this was, I believe it was 1916, that he finally sort of got his chance in front of the Supreme Court. And one of the compelling arguments in his brief is where he compared himself to Benedict Arnold. And so he said, by name, General Benedict Arnold was an American, but in his heart, he was a traitor. And he said, by name, I am not an American, but in my heart, I am a true American. And when I saw, when I read that brief, and I saw the documentary first, and then I went to read the actual full legal brief that was presented to the Supreme Court, I was really impacted by that, because this was over 100 years ago, this argument that this gentleman made, that in his heart he was he was American, but in name the government didn't recognize that. And that, to me, it echoed with the stories that I heard in the 100 interviews that we did with undocumented students, and the ethnographic work that we did for well over a year, and even in the survey work where we asked students about their identity and how sort of they view themselves, that this notion that they were Americans by heart, and that that should be recognized was something that sort of just stuck with me, and it sort of came up when we were trying to come up with a title for the book. But that's really sort of what's at the crux here of this issue, even today. So even 100 years later, long after Takao Ozawa, passed away, and he was never able to, when the law finally changed, he had passed away. So all of the work that he did to eventually contribute to changing the law so that, you didn't have to be white to become an American, that Japanese Americans and people from all over the world could earn the right to become a naturalized citizen, he was not able to see that. But that struggle continues today with millions of undocumented young adults, children, and families who live in this sort of limbo, who contribute in a variety of ways, who are role models and are model citizens in terms of their civic activities, and yet there's no place in the law where we can recognize those contributions, right? And so the struggle for, really is a civil rights issue, is beginning to sort of reach a significant momentum. And, the conclusions that I reach based on the work that I've been doing for the past 6 years now is that, the reasons for passing legislation like the DREAM Act and comprehensive immigration reform from an empirical perspective are much more compelling than the reasons for not providing a path to legalization. I mean, that's one of the most significant conclusions. And I think something that, that particularly connects to here in California, a big milestone on a national level that was accomplished by the state of California is, as many of you know, is the passage of the California DREAM Act, which, as a complement to AB 540, which is a piece of legislation that allowed undocumented students who graduate from high schools here in California to pay in-state tuition, the California Dream Act complements that by allowing undocumented students to be eligible for the financial aid resources that the state of California provides for its residents. Well, soon after the passage of that law, I was invited to speak to different media outlets and radio shows about it, and people would call in or would sort of write in or would, Twitter a question. And something that came up consistently was, these students are taking away resources from U.S. citizens, and that's not right. That we're basically giving them something for free that they haven't earned, and that in fact there are lawbreakers on top of that. I mean, that's sort of the frame by which this issue is discussed on the national level. And it's a frame that unfortunately doesn't allow for a productive conversation, because it sort of paints the issue as black or white, right? As sort of being two-sided. And as an academic, and those of you here who are academics and are graduate students and undergrads know that most issues aren't that simple, and to act and pretend that they are just creates more problems, which it has when it comes to immigration. So, a response that, that I think it's so obvious to those of us who study this issue, but yet the general public oftentimes is not aware of it, is that describing the California Dream Act as legislation that takes away resources from U.S. citizens and gives them to people who don't deserve it is a gross mischaracterization of that issue. And the way that I sort of talk about it is this, is that in the state of California, so the state allocates money towards higher education from all of the revenue that come in, right? And a big chunk of that revenue comes from real estate tax, comes from sales tax, comes from gasoline tax, right? Those are sort of three of there are five main sources of revenue for the state of California. Those are three of the main five. The other two have to do with taxes to the corporate taxes and sort of other sort of business tax. And those three main revenue sources of the state of California, everyone contributes to that. So anyone who owns a home or rents a home, regardless of their legal status, contributes to that. Anyone who owns a car or rides public transportation, a portion of public transportation goes towards the gasoline tax, right? And sales tax. If you buy anything in the state of California, everyone who buys something, regardless of their legal status, contributes to the sales tax revenue, right? And so that revenue then, a piece of that, 17% of that goes towards higher education. So the Cal State, the CSU, the UC, and the community college system. So up until the California Dream Act, undocumented workers in the state of California have been contributing to the state budget through these main sources of revenue. But their children, once they graduated from high school, couldn't receive the same benefits that their neighbors received that were contributing equally to the state budget because the law didn't allow for it. The California Dream Act protects that, or at least corrects that, that process, so that undocumented parents and their children can benefit from the contributions that they make to the state budget. And it's really interesting that, once I sort of say it that way, which is something that to me, it took me, maybe 15 minutes to figure out. I just went to the California, state controller's office and looked at the budget and sort of figured these things out. I mean, it's not rocket science, but yet, people sort of don't bother to look up what the facts say and what the data say and how to make decisions about it. And so in all of these conversations then, the tone changes. People sort of say, now the whole argument is that they're taking away money from citizens doesn't hold, right? And so to me, that speaks to the importance of educating the public, educating politicians, because politicians oftentimes, unfortunately, repeat this rhetoric in a way that is not, again, conducive to having a productive conversation. And so in the book, there's a big emphasis on that, but there's also a big emphasis on theory building. Because in order for academic work to be of use to this conversation, we have to do good research, right? We have to be able to do, and we have to be able to apply all of the tools at our disposal to control for biases and to control for sort of our own assumptions about issues. I think it's our responsibility to do that because of, especially when it comes to immigration and sort of processes related to that, because the issue is so contentious and oftentimes driven so much by ideology that we can easily sort of go in a direction that really is not supported by what we know, in terms of the work of the scientific community. So one of the things that I highlight about, undocumented students in this book is their level of resilience, right? And so resilience, in sort of the American sort of, sort of part of the American ethos is sort of the bootstrap ideology, right? So the notion of the meritocracy. And so when we look at really stellar students, like the ones that I describe in that book that are college bound, it's really easy to assume, well, they're just naturally smart, right? They're just naturally brilliant, and that's why they succeed. What the findings suggest that maybe that's part of it, but a big part of it too is the social support and the environmental factors. So resilience theory allows us to identify what are sort of those environmental factors that facilitate achievement for children and young adults who grow up in a context that has a variety of risk factors that are negatively associated with academic achievement and higher education access. So part of the goal of the book is to contribute to that literature. The other piece of the research literature that I wanted to contribute to in this book was this idea, the experience of undocumented students as a social stigma. And there's really some really fascinating work that's starting to come out about sort of just the whole identity of being undocumented, of managing an undocumented identity, right? Because it's a socially stigmatized identity. Young adults oftentimes don't disclose that to individuals because it has severe negative consequences if it's the wrong person that you disclose that to, right? And so how do students go about it? And more importantly, from what we're seeing in the recent work of young activists, how do they turn it around as an identity that serves as an empowering experience, right? How do they sort of flip that so that they disclose not only, in sort of an individual basis their undocumented status, but in a public forum, right? And the way that we have seen with young activists in a lot of the civil disobedience activities that particularly that occur here in California, and this notion, this slogan that is very common in a lot of these civil disobedience actions of undocumented and unafraid, right? That it is now going from being a socially stigmatized identity to an identity that has allowed this subgroup of civically engaged young adults to become part of the political conversation and the political process by highlighting their undocumented identity, right, and highlighting their undocumented experience. And so, so there's a lot about that tells us about social identity or the management of social stigma that I think it's important because the significant trend that's coming out now and our work hopes to continue to build in this direction is the importance of providing mental health support for many young adults who don't have access to support groups that can help them manage that stigmatized identity. And so most recently, some of you may have seen this in the newspapers. There was a young man in Texas who took his own life, high achieving, he was one of the top students in his school, and he lost hope. And he left a suicide letter where he talked about sort of just giving up because he felt that there was no hope for him in the future. He was an aspiring architect, and he had already been accepted to several universities, and so that brought attention on a national level to the need to pay attention to other developmental aspects of the undocumented student experience, in addition to just the issue of higher education access and policy discussions. My training is as a developmental psychologist, so in addition to the policy work that I've been doing, I'm also interested in the overall well-being of young adults and children. And this is an issue that, that we have started to focus on, and my student, Richard Cortez, who is a recent Ph.D. graduate from CGU, has written, we've written about sort of the social emotional experiences of community college undocumented students. And so, so really, the work is intended to sort of be a starting point for future scholars and other immigration researchers to continue to build on that, because there's a great need for empirical work. There's a great need to inform these national debates and discussions. And I think the timing is particularly relevant today, given sort of presidential elections coming up, and the issue of immigration reform will be one of those topics that, particularly here in California, we're going to be interested in hearing about. And so